Now here we go.
Hello, this is Jasun Horsley of horticulture.com. This is the first in a series of readings, of summations of my book Prisoner of Infinity. That is UFO, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation, which was released this year from Aeon Books. What I'm going to attempt to do is to go through the book chapter by chapter, not so much reading from it, because I think that would be not very interesting. And of course, if you want to read the book, you just have to buy it. But summing up the main points, just going through it in order to introduce the themes and some of the data points that the book contains, hopefully to generate interest in the book itself, but also as an alternate way to introduce this information and this knowledge to new audiences. So I'm starting with the introduction, and that is to introduce the subject of the book, which is Whitley Strieber, and on the assumption that at least some people have never even heard of the guy, much less read his work. So Whitley Strieber was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1947. No, I beg your pardon, 1945. Of German descent. He went to Catholic school. He studied at the University of Texas London Film School and the London School of Economics. Apparently or supposedly he graduated from all three colleges in 1968, which was a key year in Strieber's narrative, the year that he was in London. Strieber first became famous around 1978 when he published Wolfland, his first novel, which was about werewolves, roughly, and that was adapted by Hollywood very quickly, made into a film with Albert Finney. His follow-up novel was The Hunger, which was also made into a Hollywood movie with Catherine Deneuve and David Bowie. Prior to this, Strieber had worked in the advertising industry in New York. Been very successful there, apparently. Strieber's brother is a lawyer, and Strieber comes from quite high power family in Texas. At least that's according to Ed Conroy, spoke to me once off the record. Now, Strieber's real celebrity, well, certainly the controversy around Strieber, began in 1986 when he published a book called Communion, which reported Strieber's experiences of encountering non-human beings in the night in his cabin in October and December of 1985 in upstate New York. And the book, which took him, I guess, only a few months to write, because it came out in 1987, recounted these experiences in detail, and with a famous cover of a drawing by Ted Jacobs of a seemingly non-human entity that matched the description that Strieber gave after his experiences. This entity he remembers as being female, but on occasion of having a penis. He was raped by these beings, although technologically raped by what would seem to be an electronic ejaculator rod as used on cattle since I think the 50s, a very archaic kind of technology which is used on cattle to force them to ejaculate, so for breeding purposes, I presume. And anyway, some device of this kind was used on him, although he does describe it as being, his experience of it anyway, as being more technologically advanced. I think it entered into tendrils into him or something of the sort. but it caused physical damage, which Strieber claimed to have suffered the after effects of for many, many years, or even to this day. I'm not sure, because I'm not entirely up to date on Strieber since I published this book, but I'm pretty sure he's talked about it in the last few years, as there are symptoms of that rape still recurring. Despite the traumatic nature of Strieber's experience, he had a more or less favourable interpretation of these beings, and has continued to have so, even though he doesn't reduce them to a good or evil dichotomy, or to a homogeneous characteristic, as in he acknowledges that whatever species they represent, they are individuals within it, so they can't be reduced to good or evil any more than human beings can be collectively described. But that's not really the point. The point is that the beings that Strieber interacted with, and the experiences that he described having in interaction with them, based on those experiences, he came away with a positive interpretation. Like, he felt they were beneficent to him, these beings, that they were helping him to evolve, despite the horrific nature of his experiences, starting with that technological rape. Strieber also studied in Gurdjieff School. I don't know what the exact name of it is, but the Gurdjieff Foundation, in the period in which he was in advertising. So he had a background of New Age spiritual indoctrination, let's say, or apprenticeship, discipleship. His experiences with these beings seems to go back to his very early childhood, when he began to remember the experiences in his present in 1985. That led, under hypnosis with Bud Hopkins, to memories of experiences in his distant past, specifically his early childhood, around the age of 8, I think, and then also an experience as a teenager or an adolescent on the train with his father, and then some anomalous experiences in 1968, which I will get to eventually. I don't really go into that till later on, but this is just a summation of Strieber. Communion was a big success. There was a film made of it, but not a mainstream Hollywood film, although it did have a soundtrack by Eric Clapton. Not a very good film, and it had Christopher Walken in the lead role. So it was an independent film with a certain degree of Hollywood prestige credentials. And Strieber was interviewed on mainstream American TV. That Communion was the bestseller. He became a public known figure, more so than he had been previously, as a result of Communion. But of course, he particularly became known in the UFO community, and he became and continues to be a spokesperson for the abduction experience. Although at the same time, something of an outlier, an anomaly. He's sort of an industry unto himself, really, I would say. And he's written, I don't know how many follow-ups to Communion it's been now, probably about a dozen. He's continued to write fiction, and his non-fiction has veered into spiritual doctrine, specifically via the book The Key, but also his book The Path. And his ministry at unknowncountry.com is very much as a sort of scientistic guru, a kind of techno-shaman, whose initiation and his instrumentalities, let's say, relate directly to non-human beings who he doesn't identify as extraterrestrial, but definitely as alien. Okay, so that is Whitley Strieber. One of the key points that I make in the introduction about Strieber is that in a certain sense we can map the narrative creation element of UFO accounts and the UFO mythos in miniature with Strieber, insofar as he went from a fiction horror writer to a non-fiction horror writer. His books became no less horrific and profound and supernatural. Perhaps profound isn't the word there, but fantastic and unusual, and seemingly supernatural, beyond the realms of what we consider possible, when they veered into non-fiction, or at least he made the claim that they were now non-fiction. And of course this generated some controversy. The mere fact that these accounts were being written by a previous fiction writer of horror, and that Strieber's continued to blur this line, and that he continues to write fiction works which he claims serve as delivery devices for real knowledge that he has, such as The Greys as a novel, Majestic was a novel based on Roswell, and so on. And this phenomenon, or this spectrum, can also be observed in the UFO information base, if you like, or the narrative itself, in various different ways, one of which being that UFO researchers such as Jacques Vallée and particularly John Keel, I think, have observed that experiences recounted by experiences of UFO phenomena, such as a car engine that dies when a UFO passes overhead, and various other experiences that soon became staple ingredients in the UFO narrative, first appear in fiction, as in Keel, and I think Vallée also did the research in terms of finding, as well as they're able, the first time such an account had appeared in testimony, UFO testimony, and then locating a similar or identical description in fiction that predated that. They were not suggesting that these people had read the stories and then used them to embellish or elaborate their stories, their fantasies, although that's also possible, but there was something about the phenomenon itself that emerged, first of all, in imagination, a sort of dream reality such as fiction writers tap into, before eventually arriving in concrete ontological existence. Now, whether or not there's any truth in this is certainly one of the questions I raise in Prison of Infinity, because of the other one of the other key ways in which this spectrum is observable, insofar as mass media, let's say particularly comic books, science fiction novels and Hollywood movies, developed fantasy narratives around aliens, flying saucers, spaceships, and extraterrestrials, and even abduction very early on, in some cases before the first known sighting or abduction experience, not that they happened synonymously or congruently, because the first sighting was 1947, Kenneth Arnold. First abduction, famous one, was Betty and Barney Hill, which I guess was in the 1950s. Anyway, for example, H.G. Wells wrote War of the Worlds in the late 1800s. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact dates at my fingertips. And H.G. Wells did his famous radio broadcast of it in 1938. So, although that is not an abduction narrative, it's certainly an alien invasion narrative, and that had a profound impact on the collective imagination, let's say, particularly in America, well before any flying saucer accounts began. And certainly if we think about Strieber, who grew up in the 50s, or anyone alive today, whether or not they're interested in UFOs, but certainly any UFO researchers alive today, they would have grown up in an environment in which this imagery, these archetypes, these narratives, these memes, or this particular meme, was already quite widely spread. I mean, this is one of the reasons, perhaps the main reason I chose this image for the cover of Prisoner Infinity, being that this is a photograph from the 1950s of a child in a mechanized toy outside a convenience store. Presumably you put a nickel in or a dime and the thing would move around for 5 minutes or so, and the kid could have some fun while the parents were shopping. Now, one of the things I look at through Prisoner Infinity, well, first of all, the point I make in the introduction is that it's not possible to separate the beliefs and the ideas and the imagery that people who went on to believe in UFOs or become researchers of UFO phenomena, as in to believe in the extraterrestrial narrative, I mean, or at least the non-human narrative, from their cultural indoctrination as children, that we had already been given, as it were, a psychic filter consisting of this imagery, this iconography, these narratives around non-human visitors from outer or inner space interacting with us as human beings, using technology to do so, and specifically the flying saucer. And because of that, there's no way to really gauge to what extent that filter has shaped or determined our interpretation of these experiences, or simply this phenomena, which is, if we haven't experienced it directly, then it's already been pre-interpreted when we experience it. If we read about it or watch documentaries or listen to supposed experiences of it, they've already interpreted it naturally. They wouldn't be able to describe it otherwise, and they've only done so by filtering it through their own preconceptions about reality, which include these primary narratives and imagery around the flying saucer alien presence on the Earth through purely fictional constructs. They were never meant to pretend to be anything besides fiction. In those early days, well, they still aren't. I mean, they still exist. Plenty of media that are not pretending to be anything but fiction, but that represent these realities. Of course, now the two have fused for quite some time with something like the X-Files, which can have its cake and eat it by presenting itself as fiction while at the same time referring to supposed non-fiction or quasi-non-fiction information about the alien presence on the planet. So, simply put, it's all become inextricably bound together, the fiction and the fact of this phenomenon. And the other point that I was going to say about this, that is throughout Prisoner Infinity, the other question about this phenomenon is not only can we not determine the extent to which these media, these memes, have influenced our interpretation of this phenomena, but nor can we be sure the extent to which these memes were created deliberately in order to do so. In other words, that the same intelligences that are behind the phenomena of an apparently alien presence on Earth could also be behind these mass media fictional narratives. Precisely that it's one and not two agendas or phenomena in the culture, and that is to a large extent what I believe it to be. I believe it to be a single phenomenon that's emerging, but on the other hand, I don't reduce it to a purely human psychological operation. I think there is some merit in the interpretation that Strieber himself presents in the final pages of Communion, that whatever this presence is, or at least insofar as it's non-material and or non-human, it does require the corridor of our minds or our belief or our imagination or our psychic energy, the plasmic ectoplasm of our psyches, to fully materialize in this reality. I certainly do not rule that out, in which case the attempt to manipulate our perceptual faculties and thereby shape our interpretations of a generally more psychic phenomenon in order that it assumes a concrete reality according to those manipulations, isn't limited merely to a kind of hallucination. It may actually be a means to make real something that began as mere potential, to manifest psychic reality into physical form. I think that we can't rule this out because we don't really know where the limits are. In terms of psychic materializations and manifestations, I use the example in the book of stigmata, just for something that isn't too controversial, that it does seem to be established that even if we can't actually psychically materialize physical objects or anything to that extent, we can at least, I think, if under deep hypnosis or possessed with powerful, passionate beliefs, manifest psychic, physical symptoms through psychic, through a focus of our psychic energies, let's say. However that happens, it's not really clear, but something metastasizes. Never try to say that word in polite. Note to self. A psychic reality into a physical one. So I think perhaps the other main point in the introduction that I make is that it's impossible to separate an exploration of UFO phenomena from an exploration of the way in which narratives are generated, starting and ending with the narrative of the self or of the identity. And I point out the oxymoron of an unidentified flying object. A UFO is an identifier that identifies the thing being identified as unidentified. So there's a symbolic microcosmic representation of an ontological or an existential reality for us as psychological and physical and spiritual beings, that the UFO points towards, which is that phenomena impacts us in such a way that we generate narratives around it in order to try and grapple, get to grips with it. But in that process, as we're generating the narrative, then the phenomenon itself begins to conform to the narrative, and then of course we forget that we've done so because we're in that liminal period of not knowing, not having a narrative and not having identified the phenomena of existence. So we can't keep track of that because it's liminal, it's not yet fixed, and so we don't even notice or remember how we've shaped the phenomena that we're interpreting by interpreting it. And so we end up with an interpretation that in a sense has supplanted the phenomenon itself, the map, instead of the territory. And so the UFO is a potential means for pointing us back, I'm going to say away from the finger, but is it to the moon or is it to the hand? I think it's more to the hand. Like, we are that which is pointing, and what we're pointing at is somewhat arbitrary. It's that within us that points, that identifies, that interprets, and that generates narratives, that is the true source of reality. That's where reality is found. maybe this is the trickster element of the UFO and why it simply can't be trusted, and regardless of on what level we discover that, there are many levels in which the UFO cannot be trusted. Any external phenomenon can't be trusted, I would say, not to lead us to ourselves, because the way is inward. So, but I'm coming off track there. Certainly, that may be the underlying theme of Prisoner of Infinity, but I just touch upon it in the introduction, and as a way to recontextualize the UFO in terms of not that it is a purely psychological phenomenon, but also that if understood or examined or explored through a psychological lens, it potentially forces us to recalibrate or to polish our psychological lens, to reach a deeper understanding of what we mean by psychology and how we apply it. Because psychology, if it's true, the study of the soul, has to be wide and deep enough to encompass everything that we are as human beings, because there's nothing beyond the existence of the soul except that which created the soul. And but if what we are is a soul existing in existence, then that is our that is the whole of our experience that is possible, available to us, is the soul experience of ourselves as souls. And psychology is an aspiration to that, let's say. And so I believe that whenever we explore or investigate anything at all, we're essentially attempting to get to the truth of ourselves, and that the truth of ourselves is that which is represented by the concept of a soul, which of course is much more than a concept, just as the psyche is more than a concept. But that because the soul is not empirically measurable, although Whitley, Strieber and Jeffrey Kripal, or is it Cripple? Not sure. I think perhaps want you to believe that it is, or even want it to be true that it is. But because it isn't, we're talking about something that exists outside of space, time, or mental categories. We have to, in order to experience the soul, we have to expand the parameters of everything, really, of our perceptions, never mind our interpretations. We have to let the soul abduct us, take us into its reality. And so those who are drawn to ufology or occultism are drawn in a similar way to those who are drawn to religion. The difference being that religion is a already completed system that we are invited in to submit to, and therein lies its power, I would say, potentially. But UFO study and occultism and other New Age things, spiritualism and even spirituality in most cases, the appeal is to the Western ego in that it's collaborative. You can bring to it your own tool set, your own desires and whims, and sort of figure that you're just building your own customized one man or one woman religion. And I can relate to that. That's certainly been my path, but it's a path that did eventually lead me to a dead end, although there was some very interesting writing on the wall at that dead end. And once again, that Prisoner of Infinity is sort of the transcript of the writing on the wall that I was able to read once I'd reached the dead end of self-willed, customized, do-it-yourself bootstrap spirituality. Alright, maybe that's enough for an intro, because that is, I think, that does cover the main points of the introduction to Prisoner of Infinity. And may as well keep these video audios shorter rather than long for now. I was thinking they'll probably be an hour a piece, an hour a chapter, but we'll just see how this proceeds, and hopefully there will be enough of you interested. What about 400 followers, subscribers on YouTube now, which is not very many depending on your frame of reference compared to other researchers out there. It isn't, but I'm not necessarily out for a big following so much as serious-minded people who are paying close attention and willing to apply this knowledge or this experience, my own, in their own lives, and to develop their own lenses for examining their own experiences and having an encounter with their souls. There's really nothing more important than that, and if I can facilitate that in any way with one person, that counts for a lot more than just providing some titillating conspiratainment brain candy for 1 million people, or even motivating them to clean their rooms. Alright, so on that slightly barbed joke reference to you know who, or maybe you don't, not Whitley Strieber, I will sign off for now. Like this video, do subscribe and comment in order to support this venture. I will also put an audio link up somewhere or other, my website, as you'll see in the titles, horticulture.com. My weekly podcast is The Liminalist, the podcast between. This is Jasun Horsley. Thanks for watching or listening.
Most people really don't believe me. I know that. I live with that every day of my life. I've been pretty well tuned out by the media. If anything is remembered of me, I guess in the general world, what they remember is, rectal probe, or he's a disturbed man, he's crazy, or something like that. But the truth is, I am not crazy.